Hi, welcome back to my workshop. Today I'm going to show you how I scratch built a small scale house. It started with a small resin base and I ended up with a structure. Now a friend of mine had this small cast resin base sitting around. I told him it looks like it should have a building on it. And he agreed, so he asked if I could make it into a scale house. So I started doing a little research and finding photos of scale houses that would fit on the base. Most of them have a flat front and a sloped roof. So that's what I planned on building. First I dug into my siding and I got out some board and batten. Then I started taking pieces of it and putting it on the base to see how it would look. So I decided to use it and I came up with a plan. Then I started laying out on my siding how I was going to cut it out. Once I had cut out my siding, I sanded the edges of them smooth. Then I did some test fitting on the base to see how they looked. I was happy with that, so I dug into my stash of spare windows and doors and dug out a few that would work. Then I started laying out on the walls where they would go. Then after I braced the walls, I started cutting out the window openings. I started the cuts with a scalpel and then finished them off with a sharp X-Acto blade. I had done a little distressing of the wood with a wire brush. Then I continued cutting out the openings for the doors and the windows. And I did some distressing on the bottom of the wood siding as well. Now one thing to be aware when you're cutting out openings for windows in board and batten, you don't want the window to sit on top of your battens once you put it in. You can see here what that looks like. Now the easy way around that is to scribe where the edge of your window frame is and then use a chisel point blade to remove the battens in that area. And then your windows will sit down flush against the boards like this. So I glued the four corners of my building together. It's just sitting on the base at this point. Then I took my windows and I primed them with an AK primer. That primer was going to be the base color. Next I used the sponge technique to apply a couple of gray colors to make it look like peeling paint. I like that technique, but it doesn't get into all the corners and crevices. So one thing I like to do is use a watercolor pencil. You can see how you can get into the very corners in this image. And once you've covered it, then you use a brush dipped in water, and the pencils are water reactive. They end up making for nice dirty windows. Now once your window frames are dirty, when you put your glass in, you don't want it to be clean. So one thing I like to do is mix up a very thin wash of Flow Aid and some brown paint. And then you apply this to the window glass. And it makes the windows look just as dirty as the window frames. Now it was time to start staining the building. I used Hunter-lined driftwood for this, and I gave it two nice heavy coats. Then I got some parchment chalky paint, and I used a little Flow Aid so that it wouldn't go on as heavy. Then I brushed this all over the building, being careful not to have too much of this mixture on my brush. That gave it a very thin look that made it look like the paint was fading and peeling off. Then I went around the base of the building with a Vertero murky brown, and if you just lightly touch this to the bottom of the wall, it soaks in and makes it look like the wood is rotting from the bottom up. Now it was time to glue the windows in place. And I used a super glue with an accelerant for this, but you could also use a white tacky glue. Then after I put the windows in place, I came back with some shades and put them behind the windows. Now it was time to build the roof for it, and I had cut a piece of cardboard and then glued a couple blocks in place to make sure it was centered when I put it on. After painting the underside of the roof, I used some of my tar paper strips and put them on top. Then I picked a smokestack out of my junk box. The key to getting these cast metal ones to look pretty good is do a lot of sanding of the seams all the way down until it's fairly smooth, because any seam will show after you've primed and painted it. And I went ahead and put rust colored primer on it. Then on the building I marked where I was going to put it and drilled a hole for it. I wanted to have a support further up, so I bent a piece of wire and just cut it and then drilled holes for it in the upper part of the wall. Then I used a mixture of liquid dull coat and some artist pigment and coated the whole smokestack with that. And once it dries, it gives a kind of rusty, burnt look. And I went ahead and glued the smokestack in place along with the bracket up at the top. Now it was time to address the base. It had just been painted with a gray paint for the decking. And I went over it first with a couple different color stains to pick out random boards. Then once I was done with that, I went over all of the decking with a color that blended it all together. Now it was time to glue the roof onto the building. So just some tacky glue and a weight took care of that. Then I was going to put roof joists underneath it, so I marked out where I was going to put them. And I cut a whole bunch of small roof joists using my ultimation slicer. Then I just used white glue to glue them in place where I had marked underneath the roof. This is how the joists come out. I come back once they're dry and nip off the ends with a cutter. Then before gluing the building to the base, I did a little bit of weathering of the decking. Then after I'd glued the building on, I come back with some powdered leaf debris and glue it in place around the corners. And I was done with it now. This was a fun little project. It only took a few days. And it'll look good on my friend's layout, weighing the coal cars as they're leaving his mine. I took it out back to take a couple pictures of it on a little platform that I have. I was glad I saw that base sitting at my friend's house. This was a lot of fun to build. And I want to thank you for watching, and hope you come back to my channel to see more.